Just the two of them on stage.
Well, we're anxious to get our conversation started. Marc Mauceri, is that the right pronunciation?
It is.
Yes?
It is.
Is a stalwart and a pioneer in truly independent film distribution.
Pioneer is pushing it.
Well, a lot of, how many from, because you've been doing it, you said, what, 31 years?
Yes.
Well, that's pretty intense. I mean, how many distributors that were even happening at that point are still going?
Very few.
Very few.
Survivors.
I mean, I think of Cinecom and Film Dallas and, Orion Classics.
There's so many. I mean, Kino was
Kino's still
right
going.
at the same time.
Yeah.
Sorry. Oh, sorry. Kino. There's a couple, but a lot of our brethren have succumbed.
Yeah, it's
or
tough.
Or been merged into something else, or just
tried
got
to make
tired.
a couple of films on their own.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
found out what that was all about.
Yeah.
Well, maybe just briefly sort of outline, if you would, your company, how you operate, what kinds of distribution you do, the kinds of films that you're looking for, and then, I mean, there's a lot to talk about, but if we could just start there, that would be fabulous.
Sure. First Run Features was founded in 1979. It was founded at a time when there were not very many independent distributors. So a bunch of filmmakers got together and formed a cooperative of filmmakers, and then they hired a booker to book their films around. And within about 4 years, they were in debt and not getting along. And at that point, a man came in who is currently the company president. His name is Seymour Wishman. Came in to sort of advise them. And he ended up taking over the company and normalizing it, turning it into a regular non-co-op at a regular company. He then, with some luck, but with also a really keen eye, he spotted 2 films in very quick succession that just did terrifically well for the company. The first one was Sherman's March by Ross McElwee.
Yeah.
And the second one was 28 Up by Michael Apted.
Right.
And they were within a year of each other, so Sherman's March was acquired and played around, and that was back in the day when if a film was doing well, it could play for a year in a theater in New York City and in other markets. So that film just did, bonkers, sort of helped save the company. He then took the profit from that and convinced, I think it was Granada, who controlled the Up series at that time, to, hey, let us try this in a movie theater, because they made the Up series for television. So he worked with Michael and others to cut it into a feature-length documentary, which then went on to play a year and longer around.
I don't know if people know this. It was a series of films, 7 Up, every 7 years, 7 Up, 14 Up, 21 Up, 28 Up.
Yeah.
That focused, it's a British director, and focused on a group of...
It's about 14 kids that were filmed when they were 7 years old, and then they were revisited again at 14, and then at 21, and so on. And just in the UK, they just released 63 Up. Which will be at the New York Film Festival, and which we are currently negotiating certain rights for.
Cool.
Fingers crossed.
Yeah, great. Yeah, no, very important, influential film.
And a funny story about distribution. We did so well with 28 Up that the British company that owned it then went and sold 35 Up to a much bigger, much richer company than us. And so we saw that hard work not result in us landing the next version. But then that company tanked with it. They just did a really poor job. For them, it was a small film. For us, it would have been our biggest film of the year. They tanked with it, so then we got 42 Up and 49 Up and 56 Up and a very close friendship with Michael Apted, the director.
Great. Yes. Who made some other films besides the documentaries, made some narrative films. He was the director of, was it Coal Miner's Daughter or something?
Coal Miner's Daughter.
Coal Miner's Daughter, yeah.
Gorillas in the Mist.
Gorillas in the Mist, yeah.
He did one of the Bond films. He's kind of a, he gets his paychecks for some Hollywood bigger films. But he's terrifically smart and just a wonderful guy. I really think the Up series is what he's going to be known for in 50 or 100 years.
I think so too, yeah.
Could you put the mic closer?
Yeah.
I'm sorry. To me, it sounds so loud.
So let's just, as I say, there's a lot that we can discuss, and I want to get some audience questions going too, but let's say that a filmmaker wants to distribute their film. Let's just start there. Offer us some insight onto A, how they might proceed generally, and B, how they might approach specifically and with regard to your company, and what they might expect on either front.
Yeah.
Knowing that it's extremely competitive to get distribution.
That's a big question. You know, I feel like every year in this country and around the world, there are just a lot of films made, and outside of the studio system, there are, you know, different levels of distribution, and we can keep our conversation to North America. But there's different levels of distributors, from the small to the medium, and so on and so forth. So the first, if you've made a film, I mean, the first, you know, what is the film? Is it a documentary or a fiction film? And just that question alone will sort of determine what the possibilities might be. Fiction films are much tougher to break and to find success with, frankly.
Especially now, yeah.
Especially now. I think that actually fiction films are harder to make, in all honesty.
Mm-hmm.
I've made a documentary. I don't think I'm a good filmmaker, but a really strong fiction film that really resonates and stands out, I think is just terrifically hard to pull off. So my company has specialized in documentaries over the last 40 years. We do take on fiction films occasionally, but when filmmakers come to us, it's often because they have a documentary and not because they have a fiction film. We do work with fiction films, typically foreign language fiction films, and we have some terrific hits. One of our biggest films, in fact, our single biggest theatrical hit was a Canadian film called Strangers in Good Company, which was originally titled The Company. It was called The Company of Strangers, but Paul Schrader had just done In the Company of Strangers, so we had to change the title. Anyway, that film, you know, played over a year in some markets, Denver and New York and some other markets, and is still our biggest box office film to date. And still people love it. But we do focus on documentaries, and the first, you know, what does a filmmaker do? Well, a filmmaker, you know, in a wider sense, a filmmaker has to create an awareness for their film by hopefully getting it into good festivals, winning some awards, landing some good industry reviews, and getting some good word of mouth. Distributors will be part of all that and keeping an eye on all that, and pretty quickly, I think a film will start to make sense for a larger distributor or a smaller distributor, or maybe it won't make sense for any distributor.
So when you talk about festivals, which festivals do you monitor? I mean, Sundance, clearly. South by Southwest, yes?
We absolutely monitor South by and Sundance. Those are really the two most successful festivals, and festivals that just the inclusion of your film in it gives a certain legitimacy. And also helps in marketing and placement and all sorts of other things. But it's also, you know, I go to Sundance occasionally, and for a smaller distributor, it's a little bit, it's a little depressing because, you know, the filmmakers who've gotten into Sundance really want very big distribution deals and big advances and stuff like that. So I'm sort of looking at the scraps in a sense, or perhaps waiting 4 or 6 months for those deals not to happen for those films, and then I can kind of come in and snap them up. But the festivals that I think are really the most important are ones like, you know, Toronto, TIFF, Hot Docs I go to every year, IDFA, which is a documentary film festival in Amsterdam every year. Those are the kind of festivals. I think that, I think that True False is a terrific festival. I don't go to it, but I know that they have terrific taste.
So if you see a film you like, first question is somebody else is going after it?
Exactly, yeah.
And if you can see that HBO although HBO doesn't do a whole lot of acquisition, do they?
They do not.
No, they mostly produce. But in any case, who are your competitors for trying to land a good documentary?
Well, the competitors who are distributors are companies like Kino Lorber, Magnolia, Sony Picture Classics. There's probably about 10 or 15 competitors at different levels. You know, Sony Pictures and Magnolia are much bigger than us, but we frankly look at the same films, and if they pass on it, then we have a chance at it. There's a lot of even smaller distributors than us that can be passionate about a film and acquire them. Companies like Grasshopper Films or Icarus Films. And frankly, new companies are starting all the time. But it's not just companies that we're competing with, it's also platforms. Netflix and being the biggest one.
Which is acquiring films directly off of film festivals.
Yeah. Films come to us in different ways. They come to us directly from filmmakers, but they also come to us from sales agents. So when they come to us from a sales agent, that's a whole different avenue of discussion and understanding. And then there are different sales agents. There's the big sales agents and the smaller sales agents. When they come when it's through a sales agent, that is a conversation that is more tactical, I would say. Sales agents these days might sell off certain rights. They might sell the Netflix rights. They might do a TV deal. They might, do something like that. And then they might want a distributor to come in like us and do what they call wraparound rights, where we take on just certain rights. The flip side of that is filmmakers who come to us directly who do not have that kind of representation. Because the sales agents are very competitive. The Dog Doc, which is a terrific film that we loved, is handled by one of the biggest sales agents in the country, Submarine.
Submarine, yeah.
And I've talked to Submarine I talk to Submarine all the time about their films, and Submarine is fully capable of doing a lot of direct deals for television and for the various platforms. So they have to craft a strategy that they think makes sense and that the filmmakers are on board with. But anyway, back to the films that come to us directly, then it's really, that's to me sometimes a little bit more interesting because I'm not having to have those tactical discussions with the sales agent. I'm really just able to sit down and have an honest conversation. So for us, being a smaller distributor who's not going to be spending $1 zillion on the release of a film, we've been around for 40 years or 41 years, so we're in this for the long haul. We want to survive for another 40 years. And one reason that companies go out of business is that they take too big of a gamble on a particular film that they think is going to pay off, or they start making films. So we don't want to do that. We want to sustain our company at its level, and grow a little bit, but grow smartly. So because of that, the conversations I have with filmmakers are often about trying to understand their goals and their expectations.
So, if their goal is to get exposure for the film and some money,
yeah.
If their goal is to get a lot of money, then you tell them that that's gonna,
Yeah, no, honestly, for most films that come in, if their sole goal is to maximize revenue, and really that's, we have to really believe that film has a chance to actually translate into significant revenue, which is really not the case for most films that come in our door.
And that's partly because American television, for example, does not pay a lot of money compared to European television for European product or Canadian television for Canadian product, for example.
Yeah. I mean, it's a lot of reasons. The industry is changing very quickly these days, and some of the profit centers that existed in the past have withered away. A quick study in this for us is that we used to sell a ton of DVDs, as did every distributor. And we sold more and more beginning in 2000. And by, I think it was about 2008 was the high point of DVD sales. And it was a real cash cow for Hollywood studios and for even smaller distributors like us. The profit margin on a DVD sale is very large. And usually the royalty structure is such that the filmmaker doesn't get a big share of it. So distributors made a lot of money selling DVDs. And then in about 2008 or somewhere thereabouts, it started to decline, and it's been in decline ever since. So that sort of disappeared. In the meanwhile, probably around, what, about 2012, 14, something like that, Netflix's streaming service really picked up, and we had been lucky because we were selling DVDs to Netflix right out of the box when they first started. So we have enjoyed a very good, close relationship with Netflix from their first days. And then when they started buying for streaming, then we started licensing all of our titles for streaming. We were literally, if we picked up 40 films that year, we had 40 different streaming licenses for Netflix. And the amounts would vary. You know, they might pay $10,000 for one film, or $50,000 for another, or $3,000 for this. I mean, it was all over the map, but there was an absolute open policy by Netflix to just take on a great number of films. That all started to change, and it was rather abruptly, and I wish I could find the date, but it was approximately about 2 or 3 years ago. They really turned off the spigot and I think made a decision to take on many fewer independent one-off films, especially documentaries. I think that strategically they probably looked at their internal numbers and just thought, you know, Friends or Seinfeld or the big studio pickups, you know, do so many more views, or I don't know what it was, but they sort of transformed a little bit from being the total long tail company to being a little bit shorter tail and lopping off a lot of the one-off smaller films that they had acquired in the past.
Because there was a point at which initially Netflix's whole brand was anything that's out there, you can see it on Netflix.
Yeah. And I remember the campaign that Amazon, I think it was Amazon, did for Prime right around that time period. They said, yeah, well, they have 90,000 films, but who wants to see 80,000 of them? You know, I mean, they got marketed against for having that long tail. Anyway, they made a strategic decision a few years ago to start acquiring a lot fewer one-off films, especially from distributors. At the same time, they invested in originals, so they went directly to filmmakers and said, why don't you make a film about this? Or the filmmaker goes to them and, you know, pitches a story. And then they also started going directly to those initial festivals and acquiring directly out of the festivals the Netflix rights. So that changed everything for us and for every other independent distributor.
So if a filmmaker comes to you and says, well, I want to get a lot of exposure, money, I'm not expecting a lot of money. You need to really like the film and to see its potential. You're not going to acquire, you could easily acquire 200 films a year, but you're not going to do that.
We could easily acquire even more than 200 films a year if we had the bandwidth, but we have no wish to do that, yes.
So how many films a year can you handle? How many acquisitions per year do you have?
I feel like we've been averaging around 20 to 30 films a year, and each of those films has its own path, and some of them go theatrical first, and many of them don't go theatrical. So that's the first major thing.
Because theatrical is expensive, just for people to realize that opening New York alone, and without even making a big splash, could easily cost $50,000 to $100,000.
Not so much for us, but yes, it could very easily.
So you can do it on a bare bone thing for like 25 maybe.
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. And also, you know, the theaters have changed. I mean, every part of our industry has changed, and one change is in the movie theaters that really, unfortunately, don't want to play as many documentaries as they used to. And it's really hard to get, you just can't bring up some film to a booker and say, please book it, and then they'll book it. You really have to convince them that it's going to do well for them and it's going to have an audience. And that's no small thing. So that's one of the things that goes into that conversation with filmmakers is the understanding, you know, how tough it is and how challenging it is to get placement in theaters, but also, you know, trying to get Netflix to make that exception and license their film, or whatever platform or television broadcast.
Okay, so you make a decision first of all. Does it have theatrical potential.
Yeah, that's always kind of the first conversation.
Yeah, and if it does, through first run, you're not talking about 600 theaters. You're talking about some
No.
major markets in order to get reviewed, essentially.
Yeah.
It's not really aimed at making money on theatrical. It's mostly aimed at getting exposure through theatrical.
Yeah, I think that's mostly true, but it's also nice to occasionally make money on theatrical, and it's not completely out of the question. We have some good successes. We recently, we've had this film by a Vermont filmmaker, Before Stonewall. And Before Stonewall is an old classic gay lesbian documentary. I think it was 1985 it was released, not by us. We took on rights. We became close with the producer, John Scagliotti, who lives down south of Brattleboro. We took on the rights probably about 18 years ago for DVD and then streaming and stuff like that, and I worked with him closely. Anyway, they decided to restore it in combination with the 50th anniversary of the Pride. I'm sorry, with the Stonewall riots,
Right.
Birth of Pride. So we got the rights. We had to compete with some of the people I mentioned, and we wound up with the rights, and we put it into theaters, and we all decided at the outset we're not going to spend a lot of money on this because we actually want to make a profit on it, and we played about 40 or 50 markets and have made a clear profit on it. So there is a way to do it. You have to accept that you're not going to necessarily be in the most commercial theater that demands expensive publicists or display advertising or other things. You have to figure out a way to engage the audience, to find that audience that doesn't involve spending a lot of money, which is actually, in this day of social media, not as challenging as it once was before social media and before the internet. Back then it was all, you got to get good reviews and you have to
ads in the New
have
York
those
Times.
big ads in the New York Times.
Right. Which is hard. I mean,
Which is
ads in
expensive.
the New York Times cost like $5,000 a column inch. I mean, they're,
Well,
maybe
not quite that much, but
2,500.
yeah, no, I have filmmakers who are like, can't we do an ad like that? It's a 2x5. And I'm like, well, that ad is $8,000,
Yeah.
$8,000. And the film rental,
You're not going to drive an audience with that size ad,
yeah.
really.
And to your point, yes, films in New York almost always lose money. There's no doubt about that. Even Before Stonewall probably had a net loss in New York. But you kind of have to open up New York because New York, when you send out that press release, all those critics or writers or editors have to see that it has that New York opening.
Right.
So you do have to spend money on that. You just have to be careful about it.
Okay, so that's the theatrical market. People may have questions about that. But then the other markets are television, streaming, which is essentially video on demand. Yes.
Yep.
DVD still.
Yep. Still.
There's an educational market.
Right. Yep. You've covered it.
And there's an international market, but maybe you don't deal with international.
We really don't focus on international sales. In this day and age, when we launch a film on, say, iTunes, we can, of course, open it up to certain territories. And we do that for filmmakers, especially for American filmmakers who don't have any international representation. When we launch in America on iTunes, we can also, Australia, UK, and several other countries, really, for no extra cost. The bigger films tend to have some international representation and have a chance to get distribution deals in other countries. So for those films, we're typically not working on it.
So the filmmaker will make a separate deal for the international rights,
Sometimes.
generally with a foreign sales agent or maybe directly.
I will say more and more I feel like, especially for documentary filmmakers, it's very hard to find that. And also the international sales agents who do handle those kinds of films, they're very picky, or they don't report or whatever. I mean, it's not a pleasant situation for the majority of filmmakers, I think.
I can tell you some horror stories about that.
So you got theatrical, and then you mentioned VOD. So VOD is then further subdivided into SVODs, SVOD, or subscription, and then the other big part of VOD is transactional. Transactional means that you have to, if you want to watch it, you have to transact a rental or a purchase of it.
Pay some money,
iTunes is sort of the big transactional platform, but there's a million other transactional platforms as well. And the SVOD and the TVOD, as we call it, markets are very, very different. And
SVOD and TVOD?
SVOD.
VOD, okay,
Yeah,
fine.
SVOD.
Subscription.
And TVOD,
Yeah.
And
Versus
transactional.
Yeah.
And then there's the third sort of major VOD is what we call AVOD, which stands for advertising supported. Back in that wonderful period when we were doing gangbusters on certain films, Hulu, before it became an SVOD platform, which it is now, was a terrific AVOD platform. And we had films that just, even though we were only making about 12 or 15 cents a view, we're making tens of thousands, in some cases hundreds of thousands of dollars through AVOD. Meaning that you can watch it for free, but you have to watch a commercial at the outset, or maybe every 10 minutes, or however it's structured. So that's what we call AVOD. And AVOD is actually coming back into vogue now. There's some very successful AVOD platforms, and we are working on that. The thing with VOD, which is really what most people want to talk about, I feel like, most filmmakers, and really it's how probably Americans consume most of their movie watching, is orchestrating all that together in a cohesive, coherent way. Because obviously you want to have all of them, but you really cannot, you can't necessarily have all of them right at the start, you know. It just doesn't really work that way.
So for most independent filmmakers, video on demand is really the most, is where they're going to find their greatest potential for exposure.
I think for some films and filmmakers, yes, but certainly not for all filmmakers. There's a lot of different outcomes that I see in my films. It's very interesting. You know, I was just analyzing some sales in the last 6 months, and I realized that I had several titles that DVD, even though I've talked about how DVD is sort of is in a kind of slow collapse, have done better on DVD than they have on VOD. And is that because of the demo? Is it a film that just appeals to people who buy DVDs? You can sort of make generalizations about the whole thing, you know. And the big one, of course, is that, well, if you're over 30 or 40, you still watch DVDs, but if you're under 30 or 25, you don't even know what a DVD is, right? But we still have some films, and that DVD profit margin still exists. And, you know, I still watch DVDs and Blu-rays. I stream films. I still love DVDs. And there's something about the notion of actually having this object in your hand that you're going to collect or share with your family or give to a friend or whatever. It's a different viewing experience.
And what's the current market for television, for films that you acquire?
It's just terrible. It's very challenging, and it's really a little bit like a lottery, I feel. There are networks or broadcasters out there who still purchase independent films like ours, but you know, for every slot there's probably 100 or 1,000 films going for it. Every distributor and sales agent and filmmaker is trying to achieve those slots.
And that includes cable. So in other words, Showtime.
HBO, Showtime, Stars. It includes PBS, so it includes independent lens and POV. It's just very difficult. That's the message I can tell you.
And then how about television syndication? So commercial television, but selling separately to TV stations around the country.
For us, that only works in the world of public broadcasting. There are a couple public broadcasting syndicators who will, on a selective basis, take a film and you know, sort of give it out to the various stations with the idea that you know, Rutland or I don't know, Montpelier or Orlando, that public television station and that thing might actually play it. When they play it, though, they're going to pay $500, $1,000, $2,000. So what you need to do is work very, very hard to get a network of PBS individual stations to take on a film, which is it's a lot of work.
So American Public Television is one of those groups, that takes out
APT.
a film to individual public television stations around the country. And then there's another syndicator in public television where you get no revenue, and I'm trying to remember the name of it. But
Well, you know,
You
public
don't get much in APT either, but yeah.
I have filmmakers who so badly want their films to be on television, and especially public television, because of the exposure, that they give their films to public television, and sometimes they pay to have their films up on,
Right.
on public television. Sometimes they might find a funder who is willing to put up, you know, $40,000 to be the presenter for their film. So that's not the case with the two strands that I mentioned, ITVS, which is independent lens, and POV. They do not expect films for free. They're wonderful, and please support, you know, independent lens and POV by watching them.
Yeah.
They still acquire a small number of films every single year, and they pay good money for it. But if you can't get in through that way, and you don't want to do the APT route, then you can go to certain people in certain markets and pay your way on. And I've had a number of filmmakers who've done that.
Okay, so we can have a couple questions, and there's plenty more that we can talk about, but I hope some of this has been informative so far. But let's see what some people have to say. I mean, you know, I've made a lot of films also and had distribution experiences which have continuously...
Not with me, though.
Not with you, no.
Thank God.
And I can share some of those case histories if people are interesting. I mean, in a nutshell, I'll say that the distribution market 25 years ago, 26 years ago, was much better than it is today. That when I took out Where the Rivers Flow North, my first feature film, we were able to sell 40,000 videos in the first round at $60 a piece.
Wow.
During the era when there were video stores. There were 35,000 video stores around the country.
Yeah, the video market used to be divided into a two-tiered pricing system.
Yeah.
So video stores would pay like $89.95 or $99.95
Right.
for a video that they would then put in their store and then rent out. You know,
And they break even once they hit that threshold, and then everything else would be profit. Yeah. And then
really DVD changed all that. DVD wiped out that whole two-tiered pricing structure, and then DVDs basically came out at $30 and less.
Right, and DVD was seen as a consumer item rather than more of a video store item, although they rented the video stores.
I think the video stores just came to realize, like, why the hell are we paying $90 for this?
Right.
And I think that companies like Disney really drove the consumer part of it much harder and stopped with the high price.
I mean, Blockbuster announced in 1997, I know because I had released a film right then, that we're no longer going to pay $60 a unit for video. We're going to pay $5 a unit, and that's what happened. But they said we will have so many videos of Men in Black that we'll have a whole wall that is nothing but Men in Black. And that hurt both independent video stores, and it also hurt independent distributors.
Yeah, it's funny. I mean, Blockbuster, just that word feels like ancient history, but it's a very important part of the whole story of distribution. Right. We used to slave away to, I mean, we would kowtow to the Blockbuster execs, trying to get them to, you know, 10,000 units at $5 a piece. Please, please, please do this. And then we'd have to hit the duplicators, you know, like you got, I need another 5 cents off that tape or whatever.
I'll tell you a funny story sometime about because when I worked with a group called Apex on my first feature film, and they toured me around to telemarketing centers around the country, where we would take them to lunch and have spare ribs, and then I would go in and tell stories about working with Rip Torn and Michael J. Fox. I would go in after, you know, the Playboy Channel, and they were doing their thing, and then before Brooks Robinson, who was a baseball player for the Baltimore Orioles, who had just done some kind of info video. It was amazing, but it actually worked. But that's a whole long story of the way video used to get marketed. But it was also true back then. So we sold 40,000 videos in the first round. We weren't getting a good TV. We were getting offered $50,000 for the television, and so we did an Oscar campaign, and then got $350,000 for the television.
Wow.
And those days are gone, and blah blah blah. But and so those deals are just very hard to get now. But let's have a couple questions and take it from there. Kathy.
Hi there. Thank you so much for your time and your insightful knowledge. I have a question about kind of the American indie film market versus the Canadian indie film market, indie film market. And so I was wondering, for emerging indie filmmakers who choice perhaps to choose between the Canadian film, I guess the Canadian film world versus the American film world, which country do you think might be a better choice, for example, to develop or...
To develop and make a film?
Yeah, and to distribute one's indie film.
Well, I think the Canadians have higher taxes and they support their arts a lot more than we do here in America. If I had a choice, and I think you have to be Canadian, so I'm not sure how that would work, but if you had a choice, I mean, Canada's the way to go, you know?
Yeah.
I think it's a smaller pond. I'm such a huge fan of Canada. I go to TIFF, I go to Hot Docs, also in Toronto, and we distribute a lot of Canadian films. So I just have a very big soft spot in my heart for all things Canadian. So yeah, I think I would vote Canada.
I mean, I'm not exactly sure what the latest information is, but I was on a panel probably 6 years ago in London and was talking about my perception of Canadian television in particular, that if your film meets the requirements for Canadian content, I said at the panel, you will get a minimum threshold of $500,000 for your TV rights. And I was then contradicted by another guy on the panel that said, no, you actually get $800,000 for the TV rights. And he said, I know because I'm the head of television for Telefilm Canada, which is the major company in Canada. So, and the Europeans work the same way. There are minimum thresholds that are substantial because the idea is they want producers to succeed and keep making films.
Right.
Whereas here there's a little bit of an attitude about, fleece them and leave them beside the road, and who cares if they make another film.
It's completely different. Yeah. We work a lot with the NFB, National Film Board of Canada, which is a little smaller than Telefilm, but there's so interrelated up there. A lot of NFB films are also Telefilm films and stuff. But I can tell you that I've just seen so many terrific Canadian films, and we have distributed a lot of them. I think that that's not to denigrate American filmmakers, but it's a little bit more. It's just a smaller market, and I think as a filmmaker being up there, it might just be a little bit easier than America if you have that choice.
And there's a view about cultural film. So Canadian content fills a cultural goal that the government sees itself funding. So in countries, and it's also true in Europe, you have these public television entities that have substantial amounts of money. So BBC, for example, in England, charges every family the equivalent of basically $200 for every year that goes to BBC. Whereas in the United States, it's $1.30 for funding per capita for funding public radio and television combined. So you think about it, $200, $1.30. And so as a result, there's a robust production and distribution culture and something that can sustain filmmakers in careers. Whereas here, it's a bit like the Wild West, and
It also comes with a lot more rules and regulations than you would ever think to know might exist. But yeah, it's arts supported by the government in a very big way.
Yeah, I was curious, actually, since you're on the panel, Jay, as well, about self-distribution.
Yeah, which has also gotten harder, frankly. But we have done self-distribution for what we call the theatrical release in all of our films, and so based on the time and the effort and the money, in the early years, a video company would give us $300,000 to support our theatrical release, and that would allow us to open New York and LA and Chicago and whatever, or work with landmark theaters and play, Seattle, Dallas.
And Jay, would you hire a booker to do that for you, or do you actually do the work yourself?
We did the work ourselves.
That's labor intensive.
It's labor intensive, but you could call. We had Richard Abramowitz, who advised us on the first film, go to these theaters, but he didn't make the calls for us. But we did that, and we played 252 venues around the country with Where the Rivers Flow North, and so. And we actually made some money in the theatrical release of the film, and we grossed around $1 million, you know, self-distributed in the theatrical. And that gave a lot of, that's what helped drive that video deal and drive the TV deal. And so that sort of worked. And when video was selling for $60 a piece, it was real money. And it's hard to underestimate the importance of the early years of the video store market to independent filmmakers. It was hugely important.
And distributors.
And distributors. Hugely important. And really is, you know, but it stopped. And that moment when Blockbuster, which was Viacom was trying to sell Blockbuster, which was reporting at the time $6 billion a year of revenue and no profit.
Right.
And so they needed to show profitability, and so they torpedoed, you know, this pricing model and managed to go from $6 billion to $7 billion and finally reported like a $75 million profit, and still nobody wanted them. So their strategy actually failed.
Yeah, well, I think they were no longer seen as a growth company.
Yeah,
a growth opportunity.
Right, and at that point, things was changing anyway.
Because there was Blockbusters everywhere. I mean, God, there were a zillion Blockbuster stores.
Yeah, so anyway.
But how did you go about doing that?
Well, we called theaters, or we called, well, it's very complicated matrix. You know, there are bookers, so if you're going to play in New England, for example, back in those days, you had to call, if you played the theater in Concord, New Hampshire, you know, the booker that controlled that theater, who was an intermediary that you had to get through, would then want you to play only theaters in the rest of New England that he booked. So if you wanted to play a theater in Hanover that was booked by somebody else, you would then get blacklisted by the guy that books theater. I mean, it was complicated all around the country. But we succeeded in getting a lot of dates and a lot of play, and we did that most recently. We did it really sort of through 2007 with my film Disappearances. And we played a lot of theaters there, and we made a deal with a group called Truly Indie also, which was part of Magnolia, which owned the Landmark Theater chain. And Landmark Theaters are sort of premium art houses in the different cities. And so for that, I mean, that was actually easier in terms of their cooperation, because they would then book us into San Francisco and Los Angeles and Seattle, and, you know, and we spent probably close to $100,000, you know, playing those markets, and it was fabulous in terms of the reviews, and we did some business, and it also did help the ancillary markets.
To get in the door, though, you probably had to have first had some success in New York with your reviews and your box office. Because right now, if you call those bookers, you know, the booker who books this theater, or not this theater, but, you know, any commercial screen in the Northeast or anywhere around the country, you know, they get calls all the time. And what's easy for them when you're booking 400 screens as an independent booker is just to plug in, you know, the stuff that has a profile. Companies.
Yeah.
When they take a chance on a much smaller film that doesn't have that national profile or hasn't had a huge success, I mean, they just don't do it anymore. They don't really take those chances.
It's harder. There's no question about it.
But there's a lot of independent theaters that are changing and are really more open to different kinds of films. I think for your question, though, it's a good question, because when I'm trying to get a film, I'm sometimes competing against other distributors like myself, but I'm often competing against that notion of DIY distribution.
No, I was curious.
And I get that a lot. And I've had innumerable discussions with filmmakers about, you know, well, we love you guys, but, you know, you're going to get your share and you have other stuff. I mean, it's an interesting discussion. It really comes down to, do you have time, and do you have money, and do you have expertise, and do you have contacts? Because if you don't have those things,
it's hard.
Then you probably should not do DIY. These days, anybody can put their film up on Amazon practically. I think that any reasonably intelligent 14-year-old can get their film up on Amazon right now and have it available for Prime. I was talking to a filmmaker the other day, who might be in the audience, I'm not sure, who said, oh yeah, I already put it up on Prime for a subscription VOD, where you make about 6 cents per hour watched.
Yeah, so it's very hard to generate any revenue that way.
But to get more meaningful distribution, and to get, you know, trying to sell your home to television or to Netflix or whatever, or theatrical or educational, which we haven't even talked about, there's a lot of contacts, and there's a lot of platforms Netflix doesn't talk to most individual filmmakers. Even the educational streaming companies that are doing well now really don't want to talk to individual filmmakers. They want to buy, they want to deal with distributors or other entities that are middlemen.
Right.
If you are an individual's filmmaker trying to sell things, could you give me an idea of the difference between selling, or how much you is expected to sell to a library or to an educational program? Like, I just would like a ballpark.
Sure. Educational has kind of fractured a little bit in recent years, and it's split up because of streaming. There are about 4 or 5 companies that specialize in educational streaming. Canopy, Alexander Street Press, DocuSeek, Film Media Group, which has a few different titles. And they have gone in with different models into universities and basically sold this concept that universities can stream films for some sort of fee. The fee differences between those companies is vast. One of them charges probably about $150 to license a film for a 1-year streaming deal. Another one might charge $2. It's really all over the map, and they have these different sort of revenue models and these different pricing plans. And there's a lot of competition and there's a lot of fallout between these companies. I deal with all of them, so I get to see it all, kind of them fighting with each other. The traditional way of selling films to educational institutions is for a distributor to charge usually about $300 to sell a DVD that also gives them the right to take that content and put it on an internal server in the university. So if Middlebury called up and they said, we want one of your films and we want to be able to use it on an ongoing way for classroom use, they would probably pay either $300 or maybe they might get what's called a DSL, a digital site license, where they pay closer to $500. Then they have that media and they can use that for some specified time period. But that's typically how it works. What they're not supposed to do is go to Amazon and buy it for $10 or $20 and then start using it for educational situations or to have screenings of it, God forbid. Although that is very hard to police.
Right, so that's an ethical decision that is made.
And any institution institutions don't want their professors doing that. But I do know professors will just, rent something or oh, I got it on iTunes for $3 and I'm going to show it to my class. I'm sure that happens all the time, unfortunately.
And going back to the DIY concept there, my wife, Bess O'Brien, makes documentaries that are about issues that have some value in educational and also institutional settings. So her film, The Hungry Heart, made about the opioid crisis in Vermont, which was then mentioned prominently in the governor's State of the State address in whatever year it was, 2014 or 15, and also because Governor Shumlin was one of the early governors to talk about switching from incarceration to rehabilitation, blah, 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 inspired by this movie, Hello, Hello. She got some very good press coverage on that. It was on Point, on NPR, and was, as I mentioned in the New York Times, stuff like that. She was able to, she priced her educational, institutional price at $150 per unit and basically sold 1,000. So that was $150,000 of revenue as a do-it-yourself outreach. And more, in fact, could have been sold. But then it involves, if you can identify the network that's going to respond to that subject, then you have potential. But it's work to do it.
Yeah. And you just have to find a governor who's going to promote your film and send them an address, which is really no problem at all.
It's... on the other hand, we also produced a documentary, a direct cinema piece about a free school called Approaching the Elephant. And it was hot, The New Yorker did a feature story about it, gave it a fabulous review. New York Times gave it a good, and so it played New York, blah, blah, blah. Film sales picked it up. And they got a $30,000 deal at Netflix, blah, blah, blah. And they've done, but it's interesting because they're selling it for $300 and they've sold probably 10.
Well, Andrew's company is not, I mean, he's a sales company, he's not
Yeah.
so much a distributor.
Right, yeah. So, in fact, I don't even know what their deal is, but, you know.
Are you sure he didn't license the rights to somebody else?
No.
He's doing it himself?
They made direct sales. I mean, they just made a deal with Canopy like last week or something, so we don't know what that's about. But, you know, there was an initial flurry of activity, but of course Netflix also has a lot of exclusivity. And so there weren't a lot of other deals that could get made, but yes.
I remember back in the day when I was making films a lot, I would sell my film to the distributor, and the distributor financed my next 3 films.
Wow.
I want to know if that's still happening with any distributors at all? We're talking about, those were educational market films though, specifically aimed at grammar school kids.
Oh.
So, does that happen anymore?
Not in my world, no. I think you need to be a pretty big distributor to be putting money into production. I think if higher and higher up the food chain, absolutely happens, and it happens in Hollywood. But for smaller distributors, probably one of the quickest ways to go out of business is to start funding films, producing films, and hoping that they all make money, because they usually don't all make money.
And I believe that one of the reasons that American narrative production is not stronger than it is because so many films have been financed with private funding and not gotten their money back, and it's just dried up the pool for investment, you know. And so that's, again, a problem that the Europeans and Canadians deal with better because they're funding it through public funding and television advances. Now, you know, if the United States were, if the average Hollywood movie is made for $65 million, and with another 50 million committed to marketing. You know, that was at least the average 4 or 5 years ago. But, you know, if you were to take that amount of money of one movie and make suddenly, through a new PBS channel, $100 million a year for funding, the world would change overnight. And there used to be an entity in terms of narrative film called American Playhouse, which was very important to the early years of American independent filmmaking. And that was, I mean, they were only operating on an annual budget of about $12 to $14 million. But they were making essentially 12 to 14 pictures a year. And, you know, The Thin Blue Line was made through American Playhouse and a number of other films. And that was a good model. But it fell apart, and it wasn't a whole lot of money. Partly because of controversy that developed around their making a picture called Longtime Companion, which had a gay theme, and was then, you know, a red-hot Bible Belt controverscy, and so they got mired in problems.
My tax dollars were funding that Long-Time Companion.
Yeah,
I remember that.
And it wasn't. The government was putting in $6 million a year, which is nothing, and they were raising $6 or $8 million a year from foundations.
3 toilets for the military, right?
That's right. Yeah. I just saw today the budget for military bands. There are 130 military bands in the United States that have a budget of $480 million, which is 3 times the budget of the National Endowment for the Arts, that is funding everything across the country. And just, it's nuts. But, you know, I mean, it's so, you know, if you're working in a cultural sector, including a cultural media sector, you know, it's a starved area for sure. And the other countries do, because the French know if they don't fund their film industry, it'll get wiped out by Hollywood, essentially, in terms of, you know.
By Netflix.
By what?
By Netflix.
By Netflix, yeah. And that was a huge issue when the Clinton administration negotiated the GATT agreements, these trade agreements with Europe. The French refused to buckle under the American pressure to stop funding their film industry. And the French finally demanded what they called a cultural exception, to the point where they said, we won't sign the GATT agreements unless we can protect our film industry. Yeah. And the United States took both France and Canada to the World Trade Court to try to force them to stop funding their own indigenous film industries. Because Hollywood penetration of the international market was so high. And they wanted, you know, worldwide it's like 92%. But in France it was only like 76%. And they wanted that additional, percentage.
Greed. You have to know that, right?
Anyway, so this stuff is very interesting, and it does shift, and almost every 6 months there seems to be a new.
This industry is changing so quickly. I mean, 31 years in it, and just stuff is changing more faster than it ever has before. I think what we're up against in many ways is not these kind of changes that we're talking about, but just the changes in Americans and what they watch and how they spend their time.
Addictive series is the name of the game.
Their phone, YouTube, all sorts of stuff are now taking that time that they used to watch, films. Even Hollywood film. I think if you looked at Hollywood film viewership, even though they're still making a lot of money, it's probably down on a per capita basis. And certainly in the independent world of all the kinds of films that we see here, it's down, in every way. And as you say, it's series, but it's also even beyond that. It's people who watch stuff on their phones or their iPad that are not even necessarily films.
Well, film itself has moved from becoming an event-based media to an individual consumer good. And that's, even for independents, I mean, there were films and they would have their moment.
Yeah, and that's a great point. When I'm talking with filmmakers about that initial theatrical or semi-theatrical release, creating an event out of a screening or an opening of a film is so important these days.
Right.
People who go to movies are more likely to go to the movies if they know that the director's going to be there, or if there's something going on that is simply beyond just paying $12 and sitting in a chair and watching the film.
Right, yeah. And that's sort of how we continue to do our initial release. I mean, but it requires my being there for every screening. And like this summer, I've done like 16 dates, and I don't really want to do any more than 16 dates, But in the old days, I mean, with Disappearances, which we did in 2007, we played 110 dates in Vermont. With Peter and John, which we released in 2015 with Jacqueline Bissett on Cape. We played 64 dates on Cape Cod and the islands, and we grossed like $60,000, which was pretty good, but it was hugely labor intensive. And I had a couple of students working with me and blah, blah, blah. On Disappearances, we actually had 2 teams on the road for 2 summers, one of which were just students of mine, and I was with the other team. And the guy on the other team, the student, was asked so many times whether he was me that he started saying yes and doing the Q&A as the director of the film. It was fabulous.
That was a good one. But I will say, you are the exception. You're a master, extremely experienced person who knows how to do all this stuff. Really, most filmmakers do not have the wherewithal to take on what you've done.
It's also gotten harder. And it's also the regional basis means that I'm not, now at this point, putting the effort into playing Chicago and Seattle, which I did in the early years. Right. I'm playing all over New England, and that's plenty. Is sort of the way I feel about it. And there's not, and it's true that people have, it's harder, audiences are harder to get today, partly, because my audience is also sort of my age, and that's another problem. And then I go out with a sci-fi film, which I did this summer, and they're saying, what? Yeah. Why'd you do that? That's not a Vermont film. Which it actually is, but it's not the Vermont people are familiar with. Anyway, other questions? We had a couple of other. Yes.
For every dollar I send into Netflix, who gets what part of it?
What does the filmmaker get?
Well, you got Netflix, you got the distributor, you got the filmmaker. Who else gets a chunk of it? And roughly, what do they get?
Well, Netflix spends the vast majority of their money on content. Whether they're producing that content or purchasing that content. So it is flowing to entities that might then give it to other entities, and it might eventually make its way into the pockets of filmmakers. But there's not a clear line of that happening. But certainly, absolutely, Netflix, the bulk of money that goes into Netflix goes towards content acquisition or production. It's not going towards, jets and fancy lunches and stuff like that. They really are, focused on spending billions of dollars a year to create their empire.
And they're losing a lot of money.
And they just had their subs go down for the first time ever in their history in the US. Mm-hmm. That was very big news. In this last quarter that they reported a week or two ago, they actually lost subscribers. The overall number of subscribers in the US declined
Yeah.
And now everybody's talking about Disney Plus, which is, I think, November 12th, or the launch date of Disney Plus is going to change this industry radically, I believe. And then every other studio is going to get on that bandwagon. And Netflix is, I'm sure they're very, very nervous about the next 2 or 3 years. And I'm sure they'll survive, but it's going to be really, really interesting. We see a lot of these platform wars going on, but that launch of Disney is going to be is going to be like Armageddon.
So it's sounding to me like video on demand is, for better or worse, the main element, or self-distribution, depending. I mean, again, you know, if you're going to do self-distribution, knowing exactly who your audience is a pretty important part of that. And how the content is going to.
Well, it helps to make a good film, and it helps to make a film about a subject matter or a niche that's easily reachable.
Right. So, yeah.
Because a lot of films I see, I mean, that's one of the main things that we look at with films that come in the door is this about some subject matter that has a group of people who care about it?
Right.
And if it does, then we can usually figure out how to reach those people, even if it's a pretty small number of people.
Mm-hmm.
If it's a film that's just a great film but doesn't hit specific target niches, then it's actually more of a challenge sometimes.
Yeah. So that's good advice, I think, in terms of generating any revenue for your film. I mean, I remember reading a couple of years ago about a guy who made a film about biplanes, documentary. And there's a lot of airplane enthusiasts out there,
yeah.
And he sold loads of these planes.
Yeah, there's a documentary in the festival called Float, which is about
that's right.
The competition to build a model plane and have it fly longer. I haven't seen the film. I saw the trailer. It's a terrific trailer, and I was thinking, like, I didn't even know this existed, but there's probably a few thousand very passionate people who spend all their time making planes that try to fly as long as possible.
Yeah.
It's probably not going to make anybody $1 million, but I'll bet they're going to sell some units.
Mm-hmm. Now, in your educational outreach, do you really, like, for example, I mentioned this film on opioids. I mean, is that something that you guys would say, aha, we know where to go to, you know, license that to, or sell DVDs to educational or institutional settings?
You know, honestly, in our history, we are not primarily an educational distributor. We have, you know, hundreds of documentaries, so we are an educational distributor, but that's not our main bread and butter. We're trying to exploit films theatrically on VOD, DVD, sell them to television. All of our films are available for educational, but honestly, probably the result with that film, if you hadn't done it yourself, would be to go to purely an educational distributor who really does know that, who's maybe done a film like that before. That's not to say it's difficult to figure it out and implement a plan to do it, but
you might do just as well. I mean, you know, if for a subject like that, it's clear where to go. Sometimes it's not so clear, but anyway, other questions? Do we have anybody else that?
I just a quick question. I've heard from a number of friends of mine who have recently come out with films that I've worked on. Some say distributors have said, this is terrible. You've been in every film festival in the world and won every award. We can't distribute this. Your entire market is saturated. And then another distributor said, you've got to have some feet, you've got to have some laurels on that poster or we'll never take it. And what's the truth?
That's a great question. We have ambivalent feelings about festivals, and we really categorize them. You know, the whole world of festivals is, for us as a distributor perspective, is that there are some very important festivals. Sundance is the most important. There's some very important, prestigious festivals that just the inclusion of the film in them will help the filmmaker, will help the distribution of the film, the awareness of the film, et cetera, et cetera. But that's a very small number of festivals. And then there's some just really cool festivals that probably have a little less of cachet, certainly in terms of marketing, but still are great. You mentioned True False, you know, terrific festival. Not the biggest festival, or Big Sky, you know, up in Montana. And then there's a lot of festivals in this country that you know, charge money for people to submit, and they are festivals I've literally never heard of. And I sometimes think that they have a revenue model of setting up their thing on Without a Box or Film Freeway, charging some amount of money to get a lot of submissions. And I have talked to so many filmmakers who were frustrated with that because, yeah, I paid thousands of dollars to submit to 50 or 100 festivals, and I got into a couple, but mostly I didn't even hear from them, whether I got it. So that's part of the answer. The other thing is, I think really from a marketing perspective, the laurels are greatly overrated because there are just so many festivals with so many laurels. One of the biggest disagreements I typically have in trying to figure out the initial marketing campaign of a film for the poster and the key art and the trailer and stuff like that is often filmmakers, especially first-time filmmakers, are like, I want to put all my laurels on it, And I'm like, it's like wallpaper, it's clutter. Let's narrow it down and make it a simple, iconic kind of, selling thing that's going to work when it's this big or this big. So that's my feeling about festivals. There are some small, terrific festivals like this one that are absolutely important and wonderful occasions for films and for distributors.
Cool.
It's become, Sundance had like 14,500 submissions last year for basically 130 programming slots. And, even Cleveland had like 8,000 submissions.
It's like applying to Harvard.
Yeah, well, yeah. And so...
Except there's even more nepotism.
It becomes... That's right. Yeah. Anyway, so there is
How do
no...
we get you to come see our film?
What's your film?
Sunken Roads,
Oh.
3 generations after D-Day.
Okay.
Well, I'm going to see your film.
You are?
Yeah. I may not see it at the screening, but I view the vast majority of my films on screening links. And for filmmakers who are ever upset are like, oh, I want you to see it on a screen with people, blah, blah, blah. I mean, that's great, but at the same time, when we're pitching your film to everybody else, it is a screening link. I mean, it used to be a DVD, but now it's basically a screening link, whether it's television, Netflix, whatever, it's all screening link. Theatrical bookers, we're not like setting up screenings for the theatrical booker to see the film up on screen. So the film really has to translate through Vimeo. So anyway, that's
I figured it's a fair question.
Mm-hmm.
It is a very fair question.
Sure.
And I love being at festivals and seeing films with an audience because then you really get like a terrific sense of how that audience might respond. But at the same time, festival audiences are different than regular audiences in movie theaters. And just because a film is successful in a festival does not necessarily translate into being successful theatrically.
No, and I mean, I had not seen Dog Doc except on a small screen last night I saw it, it was a much more powerful experience. So it's, but it doesn't happen often. That's, but when it does happen, it's great, and, every filmmaker wants that opportunity to have their film seen in a group setting. I mean, I think there's just something very special about it.
Absolutely.
Hasn't gone away. Yeah.
We, if our filmmakers have a desire to try to have as many screenings as possible, we do everything we can to try to make that happen as much as we can.
All right. Well, one more question. Yes.
How do the filmmakers reach you and distribution companies? And if there is a movie already made, reach you and you like it, it's something that you want to take on. How do you start the process? Like, is this something that with the lawyers and things like that, or you just directly talk to each other and?
It first depends on whether the film has a sales agent. If it has a sales agent, then typically I would talk to the sales agent about it. But even with the sales agent, once we've established with a sales agent that we're interested, the first thing that happens is a call is set up or a meeting is set up with the filmmakers, the sales agent, and us, and then we have a conversation on that way. If the film is not being handled by a sales agent, films come to us, email, I get calls, references.
Do you look through all the films, or you just, because, I mean, I'm also an actor,
basically.
So
I'm not saying that I watch all the films.
Go into the trash.
I'm not saying that I watch all the films all the way through, but every film that comes in our door, I absolutely, I or somebody in my company checks out. It might just be, watching the first 5 or 10 minutes. It might just be, if they have a good trailer, it might be seeing the trailer. There's some kinds of films that we just don't have an interest in handling, And you know, the truth is, if you do this long enough, you can often see the first 10 minutes of a film to get a sense of like, do you like the film? Do you think it's a good quality film? Is it well crafted? Does it start well? If you can't convince people in the first 10 minutes of your film that it's worth watching, then you're going to have trouble down the line in every way.
Thank you.
Sure.
I just want to ask you a real quick question.
Sure.
On what she said. So is a trailer, on a longer documentary narrative, is a trailer the expense of it overall? The outweigh the negative, the cost of making a trailer? Is it basically a good idea to get your trailer out there and give you a better shot?
Do you mean for us or for you, the filmmaker?
No, for you.
Oh, trailers are absolutely
If you get a
essential.
trailer, do you have a better shot at actually viewing it versus, I mean, I know you said look at everything, but.
Trailers are absolutely essential for a distribution company to market and sell their film. Even an educational film, I think, should have a really strong trailer. If a film comes to us with a strong trailer already having been made, that's great. If it doesn't have a strong trailer, we try to finesse it in. If it has no trailer at all, then we have to make a trailer. One of the things that we have to do as a very small company that has to watch its money is form relationships with vendors, trailer makers, that make trailers a lot cheaper than most people would pay. So we do that, and we have a network of designers and trailer makers and printers and all this kind of stuff where I think on the whole we're paying a lot less than, say, a DIY person who just goes and pays list price. But trailers absolutely essential, especially a good trailer. And a trailer has to be the right length, and it has to hit the right notes.
This is very helpful. Thank you so much, Mark. Really,